Amina walked down the path with purpose, unaware of the shift in the air around her. She had always carried herself with a quiet confidence, but today it felt different. Her steps, usually calm and measured, were now filled with an odd tension that she couldn't explain. The campus was bustling with students, the noise of chatter and laughter filling the air, yet she felt an isolation she couldn't shake off. It wasn't the first time she had felt like an outsider at this predominantly white university, but today it felt heavier. As she walked closer to the intersection, the sun overhead cast long shadows, and the peaceful rhythm of campus life felt out of sync with what was about to unfold. She saw them before they saw her, 2 police officers standing by their squad car. Their eyes were on her as she drew nearer. It wasn't unusual for officers to patrol the area, but the way their eyes lingered on her made her heart beat faster. She tried to push down the unease that rose in her chest, telling herself that she was overreacting, that she had no reason to fear. But the weight of their gaze made it hard to breathe. One of the officers, Officer Taylor, stepped forward and blocked her path. She had no choice but to stop. His voice was sharp and carried the authority that only a uniform could provide. He asked her to stand still, his words casual but laced with something she couldn't quite place. The other officer, Officer Grant, stood off to the side, his expression unreadable, though his posture was tense. Amina stood silently, trying to keep her composure. She was well versed in these encounters, knew all too well what this moment could turn into, but she refused to let it show. She was just a student. Nothing more, nothing less. She didn't deserve this. Officer Taylor's questions were simple. At first, too simple, almost like he didn't believe her when she said she was on her way to class. He asked where she was going, what her purpose on campus was. It wasn't his questions that bothered her, but the underlying assumption that she needed to explain herself. This wasn't the first time she had been questioned for simply existing in a place where she wasn't supposed to be. The suspicion in his voice, the way his eyes didn't leave her, made it clear that he thought she didn't belong here. When she tried to explain, her words seemed to fall flat. Officer Taylor's eyes narrowed and his tone sharpened. He seemed to take issue with the very idea that a black woman like her could be walking the streets of a wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood. The words that followed were sharp and accusatory, though they weren't directly aimed at her actions, they were aimed at her identity. She wasn't the first black student to face such treatment here, but it didn't make it any easier. In that moment, Amina realized this wasn't about her being a student. This was about something much bigger, something systemic. She wasn't being questioned because of her actions. She was being questioned because of her skin. The officers didn't stop there. Their questions grew more insistent, more hostile. Amina stood her ground, not because she wasn't scared, but because she couldn't let this moment define her. She couldn't let them make her feel small. She couldn't let them see her as a threat. She refused to give them the power to break her, but then it happened. Officer Taylor's voice cut through the air with an order to turn around. The request, no, the demand, sent a jolt of panic through her, but she held firm. This wasn't just a question of her being a student anymore. It was a moment when she had to choose to let herself be dragged into a system that would dehumanize her if she let it. In an instant, the situation escalated. The officers were no longer just asking questions. They were putting their hands on her, pulling her arms behind her. Amina didn't fight back, but she didn't go quietly either. She spoke, her voice calm but firm, telling them this wasn't right, that she hadn't done anything wrong. She had done nothing more than walk down the path to her class. Her words fell on deaf ears. She had heard the excuses before, the claims that officers were just doing their job, but none of it mattered. What mattered was that she was black in a predominantly white town, and that fact had already determined her. fate in their eyes. The handcuffs were cold and harsh as they tightened around her wrists. It wasn't the physical pain that hurt the most. It was the humiliation, the realization that her dignity had been stripped away in front of her peers. Some students watched from a distance, their eyes filled with uncertainty or curiosity. Some pulled out their phones, recording the moment as if her suffering was just another spectacle for their entertainment. But Amina knew better than to believe they would stand up for her. She knew better than to expect anyone to speak out against the injustice of it all. The weight of the moment sank in deeply. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black student who had ever been looked at with suspicion, every person of color who had ever been accused simply because of where they came from or what they looked like. Then came the accusation. Theft. It was absurd. Amina couldn't believe it. Theft. She had done nothing more than walk to class, but now she was being accused of a crime she had never committed. The officers didn't care about the truth. They didn't care about who she was. They cared about the story they could sell to the public. They cared about the narrative they were shaping, the one where black people were criminals, where people like Amina were always guilty, no matter the facts. As the officers dragged her to the police car, Amina felt her resolve weaken. The tears that had threatened to fall before now sat at the back of her throat. She couldn't let herself cry, not now, not here. This moment wasn't just a moment. It was a battle. A fight for her future, for her dignity, for her right to exist in a world that wanted to silence her. At the police station, as she sat alone, the doubt began to creep in. What if no one believed her? What if this false narrative became the story everyone remembered? She had worked so hard to get here, to prove she was worthy, to prove she belonged. Now, all of that was at risk. The weight of uncertainty pressed down on her. Her dreams of becoming a lawyer, her desire to make a difference, it all felt so fragile in this moment. Could she still rise above this? Could she still hold on to her dreams when everything around her was telling her she didn't belong? But as the minutes dragged on, something inside her began to shift. The fear, the doubt, it didn't go away, but she refused to let it consume her. This wasn't the end of her story. It couldn't be. She wouldn't let it be. The system might have wanted to break her, but she wouldn't let it. She would fight, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been silenced, for every voice that had ever been ignored. This was only the beginning. Amina's world seemed to crumble with the weight of the false accusations. Each step she took on campus felt heavier, as if the eyes of every student, professor, and passerby were fixed upon her. The whispers grew louder, the glances sharper, as though every movement she made was scrutinized. The incident, one moment that had been out of her control, had painted her as a criminal in the eyes of the world. And now, despite all the hard work, dedication, and sacrifices, she was left to navigate a world where her identity was tainted. The dreams she once held with pride and certainty now felt out of reach, as if they were slipping through her fingers. Inside, her dorm room. Amina sat surrounded by textbooks and notes, but the words on the page became meaningless. Her mind was elsewhere, trapped in an endless loop of the events that had led her here. She had been trying to keep going, to stay strong, but the constant fear and self-doubt were suffocating. Would her academic future be forever overshadowed by this false narrative? Would she ever be seen for who she truly was, rather than the label that had been unjustly placed upon her? Her phone buzzed, breaking through the storm of thoughts. It was a message from Keisha, her closest friend. Though Keisha's words were kind and supportive, they felt distant. How could she understand the depth of what Amina was going through? How could she comprehend the daily weight of being misjudged, the constant fear of being deemed guilty simply because of her race. Keisha had never lived in the space Amina occupied, the space where every action, every glance, every word could carry the heavy burden of prejudice. The response Amina sent back was a simple one. "I'm trying. Thanks." But deep down, she wasn't sure if she was trying at all. Was she simply surviving, clinging to the remnants of a life she once knew? The next day, Amina found herself in Dr. Pierce's office. He had always been a steady figure in her academic life, someone she respected. But today, there was an unease about him, a hesitation in his words that Amina noticed right away. He greeted her kindly, but there was something in his demeanor that felt off. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, but there was an unmistakable undertone of discomfort. He acknowledged the situation, his words soft, almost reluctant, but the message was clear. "I've been keeping up with what's happening, Amina," he said. "I know this is tough, but I think it might be best for you to consider transferring to another school. It could be easier for you in the long run." Amina's heart sank. She was taken aback, shocked by the suggestion. Was this really the best he could offer her? A way out, a way to escape the battle that had been forced upon her. How could running away from the problem be the answer? How could it solve anything? The suggestion was a direct hit to her sense of agency. To think that someone who had mentored her, someone who had witnessed her passion and drive, would think that walking away from this injustice was the right solution felt like a betrayal. She stood up abruptly, her fists clenched, the weight of his words too much to bear. She couldn't just leave, not when this wasn't her fault, not when this was about so much more than her individual situation. "I won't run," she thought to herself. "I'm not going to disappear." Amina left Dr. Pierce's office, her thoughts racing, her emotions a whirlwind of frustration and disbelief. She didn't need to escape. She needed justice. And more importantly, she needed someone, anyone who would fight alongside her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the real problem wasn't just with the police or the university. It was the deeply ingrained system that allowed such injustices to happen without consequence. Amina wasn't going to let that system win. Not now. Not ever. The campus atmosphere felt increasingly divided. A handful of students rallied behind Amina, expressing their support and their disbelief at what had happened. But the majority, particularly those with more conservative viewpoints, dismissed her experience, labeling it as a misunderstanding, or worse, an exaggeration. They couldn't understand, or didn't want to understand, that racial prejudice was a lived reality for people like Amina. For them, it was something they only saw in abstract terms, something they thought could be reasoned away with enough logic and explanation. They couldn't see the depth of the systemic bias that plagued every level of society. Amina's heart grew heavy as she read the messages online. The video of her arrest had gone viral, but the comments felt more like an assault than any form of support. Some of them were cruel, others were dismissive, and the few that tried to defend her felt like small islands in a sea of ignorance. "She's just trying to get attention," one comment said. "She must have done something to deserve it," another added. Every new notification felt like a punch to the gut. It was exhausting. The burden of fighting not just the lies about her, but the ignorance of an entire community, was overwhelming. But something inside Amina refused to give in. She couldn't let this define her. She couldn't let herself be silenced. She had to keep fighting, not just for her own sake, but for everyone who had ever been treated this way. She couldn't allow her story to be buried under the weight of the prejudice and apathy surrounding her. And then, just when Amina thought she might break under the strain of it all, someone stepped in. Professor Harris, whom Amina had come to respect over the course of her studies, approached her. There was no grand gesture or declaration. He simply showed up, quietly, with a presence that felt like a lifeline. He listened to her, heard her frustrations, and offered his help, not as a savior but as an ally who saw the injustice for what it was. He understood the stakes. It was a simple act, but it was everything. It was the support Amina had been longing for. Someone in a position of power, someone with influence who wasn't going to turn away. Someone who was willing to fight, not just for Amina, but with her. And in that moment, Amina realized something that had eluded her for so long. She didn't have to fight this battle alone. She wasn't invisible. There were people who believed in her, who saw the truth. The path ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time in days, Amina felt a glimmer of hope. This fight, her fight, was far from over. Amina had never imagined her life would lead to a courtroom. The thought of it had always felt distant, a reality far removed from the classroom discussions and academic goals she had focused on for so long. But now, with every passing day, the fight for her future became more real. The weight of it all pressed down on her. Yet with Professor Harris beside her, she found the courage to take the first step into a battle she knew would be long and grueling. With determination, they sought out a lawyer, someone who could help her take her case to court. Professor Harris, not just a mentor, but now an ally, connected her with a seasoned lawyer who had worked on civil rights cases before. The lawyer understood the magnitude of what they were up against. This wasn't just a case about one student. It was about challenging a system that had so often turned a blind eye to racial profiling. The work began in earnest, gathering evidence, collecting witness statements, and reviewing security footage. Every piece of the puzzle brought Amina closer to the truth. Each document and statement uncovered showed the bias in the police report, revealing the injustice that had been swept under the rug. It became clear that the arrest had been nothing more than an act of racial profiling, a decision made without cause, based on assumptions that had no basis in reality. The footage showed a different story than the one Officer Taylor had told, a story of an innocent student targeted simply because of the color of her skin. Yet, even as the case gained momentum, Amina faced a new pressure. The university administrators, more concerned about the school's reputation than her rights, subtly suggested that perhaps a settlement would be best. They spoke of the damage a long, drawn-out court case could do to the institution's image. The suggestion made Amina's stomach churn. They wanted her to settle, to quiet the noise, to let them sweep it all under the rug as if her experience and the systemic issues it represented didn't matter. But Amina knew she couldn't do that. She couldn't let this be a simple matter of moving on for the sake of convenience. She had to stand firm. This wasn't just about her future. It was about the countless others who had been treated unfairly, who had suffered at the hands of a system that didn't see their worth. She had to fight for them, for every person whose voice had been silenced before her. In the midst of all the tension, Amina found herself questioning whether she was truly ready for the weight of the battle she had chosen. The pressure, the whispers from some of her peers who doubted her story, the fear of failure, it all seemed to mount up with every passing day. But when the weight of those doubts pressed down on her, Amina found the strength to rise above them. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Professor Harris, her lawyer, and the growing number of supporters who believed in her kept her grounded, reminded her that she was doing this not just for herself, but for a greater cause. The court trial finally arrived. It was everything Amina had feared and more. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, the weight of the atmosphere oppressive. She was just one person standing against the tide of a system that had often turned its back on people like her. But as the defense attorney tried to discredit her, using her race as a weapon against her, Amina stood her ground. She refused to let them define her by their prejudices. She refused to let them twist the truth into something unrecognizable. Professor Harris, with his calm demeanor and razor-sharp questioning, took the stand to cross-examine Officer Taylor. The defense tried to hold up their narrative, but with every question, Professor Harris exposed the inconsistencies in Officer Taylor's testimony. It became clear that the officer had not acted in good faith, that he had seen Amina as nothing more than a threat based on the color of her skin. His words twisted and tangled, his defense crumbling under the weight of the truth. Amina watched, her heart pounding in her chest as the courtroom turned on its axis. The more they uncovered, the more the lies and biases were laid bare. It was a pivotal moment. The defense had nothing left to stand on, and as Professor Harris's last question rang out, the room was silent. And then it was Amina's turn to speak. Standing at the witness stand, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her. It would have been easy to fall apart, to give in to the overwhelming emotion threatening to flood her. But Amina knew this was her moment to break through. This was her chance to make them listen. With a steady voice, she began to tell her story, the real story. She spoke of the pain, the humiliation, the constant fear of being misunderstood, misjudged, and mistreated. She spoke of the way the world had seen her, not as a student, not as a person with hopes and dreams, but as a threat, simply because of her race. Her voice, once shaky, grew stronger with each word. The room seemed to hold its breath as Amina's testimony filled the space. She laid bare the emotional and psychological toll of being racially profiled. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. This wasn't just a case about an arrest. It was about the heart of an entire community, about the pain and suffering that comes when a person is reduced to nothing more than the color of their skin. And in that moment, something shifted. The tension in the room became palpable, as if everyone in that courtroom could feel the weight of her words. Amina wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who had ever been treated unjustly, for every voice that had been silenced. The judge's ruling came weeks later, and when it was delivered, Amina could hardly believe it. Officer Taylor was reprimanded for misconduct, and the university was forced to issue a public apology for its handling of the case. The ruling wasn't perfect, but it was a rare victory, an acknowledgement that the system, however deeply entrenched, could be challenged. Amina had done what so many had said was impossible. She had taken on the system, and she had won. The university, under the pressure of the case, implemented new policies aimed at addressing racial profiling, signaling that there was hope for change. The victory was hard-won, but it marked the beginning of a shift. Amina had not just reclaimed her future, she had made a statement. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effect of her victory was felt across the campus. Other students of color, inspired by her resilience, found the courage to speak out. They shared their own stories, their own struggles, and slowly, the community began to shift. Amina became a symbol of hope, a beacon of light for those who had once felt powerless. But for Amina, the victory was about more than just the court case. It was about reclaiming her identity, her sense of self-worth, and her belief in the possibility of change. The journey was far from over, but she knew that with every step she was breaking down the walls of injustice, and in doing so she was paving the way for a better future. Amina stood by the window, looking out at the campus with a sense of awe. The weight of the trial, the courtroom, the scrutiny, it was all behind her now. She had done it. But what lay ahead? She found herself thinking about the path she had walked, from a frightened student, overwhelmed by the injustice of it all, to someone who had stood strong, unyielding, even when the world seemed set against her. The trial had been one part of her journey, but now it felt like the real work was just beginning. Turning from the window, she glanced at the papers scattered across her desk. A legal pad filled with notes on her future, her goals. Her dreams of becoming a lawyer didn't seem so distant anymore. They felt real, tangible. In the quiet aftermath of the case, she found herself beginning to plan, taking the first step toward what she had always wanted to do. Professor Harris was right, Amina thought to herself, feeling the familiar weight of gratitude settle in her chest. This fight, it's just the beginning. In the weeks after the trial, things began to shift. The university had implemented some changes, training on diversity, stronger policies addressing racial discrimination, but Amina knew the work wasn't over. The real change, the kind that would last, would take time, and it would require people like her to continue pushing forward. And that's exactly what she intended to do. Amina had become something more than a student. She had become a symbol of strength, a living proof that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. And now, with her newfound strength, she wanted to use her voice to help others. She found herself spending more time with other students, those who, like her, felt silenced or overlooked. Students who had experienced similar injustices, who carried with them the weight of feeling less than. They came to her with their stories, their doubts, their fears. And Amina listened. She offered guidance, support, and most importantly, the reassurance that they were not alone. "I know it's hard," she would say to them, "but your voice matters. Don't let anyone tell you differently." In those moments, she saw herself in them, saw the uncertainty in their eyes that she herself had once carried. But she also saw something more: hope, determination, and a fire that she knew could burn bright if it was nurtured. With every conversation, every piece of advice she gave, Amina grew stronger. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, and she was helping others do the same. Her relationship with Professor Harris had changed too. The mentor-mentee dynamic that had once defined their connection had evolved into something deeper, something more genuine. They were no longer just teacher and student. They were allies, friends. Through all of the challenges, Professor Harris had been a constant presence, offering wisdom, guidance, and a quiet strength that had helped Amina navigate the most difficult moments. But he was quick to remind her that it was her courage that had made the difference, that had changed the course of events. "You did this, Amina," he told her one evening, after another long day of discussions with the university administration. "You gave us all a reason to believe change is possible." Amina smiled, a bittersweet feeling rising within her. She had come so far, but she knew there was more to do. As the months passed, Amina's impact on the campus grew. She had become a symbol, not just of resilience, but of possibility. Other students began to speak out, to share their own stories. The conversations about race, about inequality, about justice, things that had once been whispered in the shadows, were now taking center stage. It was the ripple effect of Amina's courage, a movement that had sparked change in the hearts and minds of those around her. The campus began to shift, slowly but surely, toward a future where no student would have to fear being silenced or misjudged because of their skin color. One day, as Amina stood before a group of students, her mind drifted to the day of her graduation. She had once feared that day would never come. Now she stood on the cusp of it, ready to face the future with hope, with purpose, and with the knowledge that the work was far from over. And as the day of her graduation arrived, Amina stood before her classmates, her heart full. She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some new, and she took a deep breath. "It's hard," she began, her voice steady and strong. "It's hard to speak up when the world tells you to stay quiet. It's hard to fight when the odds seem insurmountable, but we have to. Because if we don't fight for what's right, who will? If we don't stand up against injustice, who will?" Her words carried through the room, filling the space with a sense of resolve. We are not powerless. We are not invisible. We are the change this world needs. Amina's voice broke, just for a moment, but it didn't falter. When I look at all of you, I see a future where we don't just hope for change, we make it, we create it. Together. The room was silent. Every student hanging on her words. Amina's journey had come full circle. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had walked into that first courtroom. She was a force, unyielding, powerful, determined to make a difference. And as the applause echoed in the room, Amina knew that the impact of her story, her fight, would reach far beyond the walls of the university. It would live on in the hearts of the people she had inspired, in the lives of the students who would continue to push forward, who would continue to challenge the status quo. The journey was not over, but Amina was ready. She had found her voice. And with it, she would keep fighting, for herself, for others, and for a future where justice was no longer a distant dream, but a living, breathing reality. Amina's story was just beginning. As she stepped off the stage, ready to face the world beyond, she made a silent promise to herself to never stop fighting, to never stop pushing for justice, to never stop believing that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. And with every step she took, she carried the hope of everyone who had fought before her and the promise of those who would come after. Amina's journey was not just her own. It was a legacy, a movement, and a testament to the power of resilience in the face of adversity.